Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Quincy Historical Society. And thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I know that the weather was looking a little bit dreary, but we're so happy to have you all here in the nice, cozy building of the Adams Academy. For those of you who do not recognize me, my name is Alexandra Elliott. I am the Executive Director here at Quincy Historical Society. And I'm not your speaker tonight, but I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Chris Makowski. So in early fall of 2025, Quincy Historical Society received an inquiry about the sculpture of the Marymount Park bas-relief depicting John Adams and John Quincy Adams sat across from each other in deep conversation. This perfectly ordinary inquiry turned into a months-long correspondence with Dr. Chris Makowski as he put the final touches on his new book, Atlas of Independence, John Adams and the American Revolution. The topic of that book is the one that we are gathered here tonight to hear about. So Dr. Chris Makowski is a writing professor from the Gendoli School of Communication at St. Bonaventure University in Allegheny, New York, where he also serves as an associate dean for undergraduate programs. He is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Emerging Civil War, and the series editor of the award-winning Emerging Civil War series, published by Savas Beatty. I've read a little bit of it, and it is excellent. He is also a historian in residence at Stevenson Ridge, a historic property on Spotsylvania battlefield in central Virginia. He has worked as a historian for the National Park Service at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, where he gives tours at 4 major Civil War battlefields: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, as well as the building where Stonewall Jackson died. An award-winning writer, Chris has authored or co-authored nearly 24 books and edited a half-dozen essay collections on the Civil War. Atlas of Independence, John Adams and the American Revolution is his first foray into Revolutionary-era history. And please give a very warm Quincy welcome to our speaker, Dr. Chris Makowski.
Good evening. Now, I realize I'm kind of pushing my luck here, so I'm from Western New York. And if anybody's just a hockey fan, the Sabres and the Bruins are going at it, right? And like the Sabres are winning the series right now, and I realize I'm kind of, hostile territory perhaps. But I'm a John Adams fanboy, so hopefully that'll make up for it. It's my real distinct pleasure. See, it's the Sabres thing, right? It's the picture, yeah. It's Ruth Gordon and Rosemary's Baby. That's what it is. So I don't handle lecterns very well because I'm a pretty mobile speaker here. But it is such an exciting treat for me to be able to be here in John Adams and Abigail Adams' hometown to talk about the Adamses. Now, you guys live here. Who am I to come from away to tell you about the Adamses? You're going to tell me a few things, I hope, and I'm going to walk away learning things for the better for it. But as a fanboy, it's just so important for me to be able to come and walk the ground where the Adamses walked, and walk the ground where you get to walk, and kind of share in those stories and be in those places. That's why the work of a historical society like this is so important, because it preserves those stories and allows us to be in touch with them. So it's just a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to be here. I want to thank Alexandra and the staff of the Historical Society. Those of you who are supporters of the Historical Society, thank you very much for the work that you do to make all of this possible, and to make my little trip into John Adams fanboy heaven possible as well. Now, I became a fan of Adams back in 2000 when I first read Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis. How many of you have read that book? Has anybody read that book? It's a brilliant book because what it does is it recasts the founding fathers as brothers. And he really kind of takes a look at how they kind of interact and takes them off the pedestal, which I think is something that all the founders really need to have happen, because we tend to look at them as these Marvel gods, and they wanted to be portrayed that way. They knew they were posing for history in their fancy clothes and their buckle shoes, and Adams just couldn't hold the pose, right? Because he's got so much he has to tell us, and it's urgent, and it's important, and it's vital, and he can't be bothered with those fancy he poses if it means that we can't get at the truth. And I just loved that about him. And so kind of this idea of the founders as brothers really proved to be a very useful way to look at these guys. And I'm going to quote the great rock and roll sage Keith Richards when someone asked him, "Why do you and Mick squabble so much?" And Keith said, "Well, we're not just friends, mate, we're brothers." It's like, and brothers fight, he said. And I'm like, well, yes, of course. I don't know if anybody here's got siblings, but of course siblings squabble. But at the end of the day, you always got each other's backs. And so thinking about the founders as people who were squabbling and fighting and had tensions and had all of these back and forths, to me was a great way to make them human. And so when I decided I wanted to finally get around to writing about Adams myself, I wanted to use that lens of conflict to see how it might illuminate John and his relationships in the times. And Joseph Ellis actually says that for John, the only meaningful kind of conversation was an argument. And that's not because he was contentious or disputatious. Remember, he's an attorney, right? And what do attorneys do? They argue, they lay out a case, they build a structure, they put together facts, they use evidence, they support it. Having an opinion is not enough. You have to be able to back that up by making a case, by making an argument. And so that's why for John, having an argument with someone was a way that enlivened him because it brought forth all of his great intellectual powers, and it forced the person he was talking to bring their A game too. So when I decided to write about Adams, I really wanted to use that lens of argument, tension, squabbling to see how that might help us better see him and his times. So I'm going to have you here for about an hour and 5 minutes. At one point, it's going to seem like the story's done because they signed the Declaration of Independence. Sorry for the spoiler, just in case you didn't know. That's how that ends, okay? But the war goes on beyond that, and Adams is intimately involved and importantly involved in some of those things. So we can't kind of end the story before the story really wraps up. So we'll feel like we're done, and then there'll just be a little bit more to go. So I'll warn you ahead of time here. So our story is going to start in a July morning of 1774 in Falmouth, Massachusetts, atop Munjoy Hill, 172 feet above Casco Bay. And John and his old friend Jonathan Sewell, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, are standing there one summer morning. It's Portland, Maine today, if you're unfamiliar with its past identity. And they're looking at Casco Bay spread out before them, boats and ships moving among the islands of the archipelago. It's a beautiful day. But there's a frost in the air, too. Not because of the weather, but because of the distance that has grown between these two men who once upon a time were so close that Jonathan referred to John as his brother. Jonathan was 6 years older, but the two of them met in 1752 as they're just getting themselves established in their legal practices, and they're really close for many years. But by the time they're together there on Munjoy Hill, Adams says, 11 years ago, I thought him the best friend I had in the world, and I loved him accordingly. Now at this moment, I look upon him as the most bitter, malicious, determined, and implacable enemy I have. God forgive him the part he has acted both in public and in private life. And then he adds what I think is one of the most Adamsian additions to any correspondence he writes. He adds, it is not impossible that he may say the same prayer for me. Right? He understands there's this awful tension, and he knows he's right, but he also realizes his friend probably also thinks he's right. And the reason this tension exists is because these two young lawyers getting along so well as they're establishing their legal practice in Boston. They've got the same mentors. They're running with the same crowds. In fact, they even start courting sisters together. Jonathan courting Esther Quincy, whom he will later marry, and John courting Hannah Quincy, whom he will not. Because on the very day he's about to propose, Jonathan and Esther come barging into the room and they break the moment. And John never kind of captures this spirit again. And a year later, Hannah will be engaged to someone else. John actually says that Jonathan rescued him from what was certain to be an affirmative and rescued him for a lifelong of servitude and a marriage that he at the time was not financially ready to support. That's good for us because that allows John to take a second look at Abigail Smith 2 years later, and things work out a lot differently. But as these two continue to practice law and hang out and be friends, the situation in Boston becomes very tumultuous. The politics begin to divide people because, of course, the British are levying taxes that are so intolerable, they're called the Intolerable Acts. There are tariffs, there are impositions on writs of assistance, which is basically an imposition on personal liberties. Eventually, the British will start quartering troops in people's homes. And as all of these things continue to snowball and the political tensions get worse and worse, Boston finds itself deeply divided. And John and Jonathan find themselves on opposite sides of that divide, professionally. But they try to maintain their friendship. In fact, one day, Jonathan stops by John's house for dinner, and he surprises him with an offer to be the advocate general for the Court of the Admiralty, which is a very lucrative post that would put John in touch with a number of high-profile, lucrative contacts and great possibilities for advancement. And John says he'll have to think about it. But he doesn't really have to think about it. He just doesn't want to offend his friend. And he puts his friend off, and weeks go by, and he puts his friend off, and Jonathan's finally like, hey, we got this great plum position. And finally, John has to decline. And Jonathan is surprised by this. But John says, I cannot accept a position that would put my professional obligations at such antipodes with my personal feelings. And this will be a key thing that runs through John's whole career, this idea of integrity. He will not sacrifice his personal beliefs for professional gain. And it's incredible because another through thread of this man's life is he wants personal attention. He wants advancement. He wants recognition. His responsibility will always tug against those sorts of ideas of advancement and integrity, and he will always continue to choose integrity and then get frustrated because he's not recognized for the work that he's doing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And so finally, these men become bitter enemies. They start sparring in newspaper columns against each other, writing pseudonymously. Pseudonymously, is that a word? Can I say that word? I'm a writer. I can make up words, right? Okay, under pseudonyms. Okay, and they really just then stop hanging out. Then they find themselves, as I said, on opposite poles. And this is a real blow because Jonathan says of John that John is a man who has a heart formed for friendship. It's one of the things I love most about John Adams. Okay? And it's in that spirit that on this July morning in 1774, that Jonathan invites John to go for a walk. They're riding the circuit together. Sewell, as Attorney General, is arguing cases for the Crown. John is a private attorney defending different cases and arguing others. And despite the chill between them, Jonathan asks John to get together and go for a walk. The reason being that John has been selected as a part of a 4-man delegation to go to Philadelphia for a new Continental Congress, where representatives from each colony will get together to discuss shared grievances. And Jonathan doesn't want John to go. He says it will be treasonous. History will rule against you, and you will find yourself on the losing side. And John says, I have passed the Rubicon. Live or die, sink or swim, survive or perish with my country. That is my unalterable determination. And the two of them discuss, they debate, they argue. And we don't have details of what that conversation looked like, but we know that we have two men at the peak of their argumentative powers, arguing against a person they know in their hearts is unpersuadable. We don't know how they part ways, whether one of them stormed off, whether they walked back to their boarding house together in sulky silence. But we do know John says that I see we must part, and I see I fear forever. But you may depend on this. This is the sharpest thorn I have ever set my foot on. And the two men will part ways. Jonathan will find himself behind enemy lines when the siege of Boston settles in. He and his family will flee into the city. They'll eventually go into exile in Halifax and then over to England, where he'll change the spelling of his last name so that he can set his colonial days behind him, and he'll live a rather impoverished life. John will see him once more when John is the minister to the court of St. James. Looks like history didn't put him on the losing side after all. And he'll go and see his friend, and they'll have a great reunion. But John will ever after consider Jonathan a casualty of this war. Now, John does go to Philadelphia. As part of that four-man delegation, he's there with Thomas Cushing, Robert Treat Paine, and his cousin Sam, who we know for his great beer today, right? Sam's 13 years older. He and his family live in Boston. He was born there. So they're separated. The Adamses are separated by geography and age. They share a great-grandfather, but they really don't know each other all that well. But Sam is a great cultivator of talent. And when John moves into Boston to set up his legal practice, Sam sees him as someone to keep his eye on. Sam's very involved in the Sons of Liberty, which is the organization that's leading the protests against these British taxations and British policies. They may or may not have had something to do with rousing up the crowd for the Boston Massacre. They may have had something to do with the Boston Tea Party. We don't know Sam's exact role in these things because his superpower is to leave no fingerprints. He cultivates culpable deniability in everything he does, even as he's the one pulling the strings for all of these things. And so he's clearly the leader, but nobody would ever be able to pin anything on him. In fact, there's a great story where he and John are serving together in Philadelphia later in the summer, and Sam is cutting up packets of letters with scissors into pieces so small they're smaller than atoms, A-T-O-M-S, and throwing them out the window to be scattered in the breeze. Or in the winter, he's throwing piles of letters into the fireplace. And John's like, what are you doing this for? And Sam says, no matter what becomes of me, none of my friends will suffer from my negligence. Right? And Sam provides an incredible political education for John over the course of the next few years. And it really says something about the relationship between these two men that John is always mistaken for Sam. Even when he goes to Europe, everyone's like, oh, the famous Mr. Adams. He's like, no, I'm the unfamous Mr. Adams. Oh, zut alors. You know, and so, and John doesn't mind. Which is incredible because, again, John has a titanic ego and he wants to be recognized. And he will live in the shadow of people like Franklin and Washington and just chafe at it. And he never minds being in the shadow of his cousin Sam. In fact, he says, the true story of the American Revolution could never be told without the character of Sam Adams. He was born and tempered a wedge of steel. Now, Sam is going to be kind of the sly fox. John will have a different approach. He'll be more like bull in a china shop, you know, or maybe we call him Clydesdale in a china shop because he's a real workhorse. But this political education is instrumental. Now, when they get to Philadelphia, one of the members of the Sons of Liberty from the Pennsylvania delegation rides out to meet him in New Jersey. And he says, listen, when we convene Congress, don't mention the word independence. Independence is unpopular here in the middle colonies as the taxes are. You'll be sunk if you say it. The next morning, the Congress meets in Carpenter's Hall. They gavel the session open. The first person to stand up is Sam Adams to speak. Everyone's expecting a stem winder of a speech from this firebrand. And instead, he issues a call for a prayer. And it sets an entirely unexpected tone for the convention. That's the kind of subtleties that Sam was excellent at, reading a room and playing it like a violin. So John's a little worried he's not going to be able to rise to the occasion. Can anybody rise to the occasion? He's going to find himself among the luminaries of all the other colonies. Who's he? Some just lawyer here from Quincy, Massachusetts. But he hopes that this Continental Congress will be a nursery of American statesmen. And he finds indeed, that there are statesmen aplenty. Here are fortunes, abilities, learning, eloquence, acuteness equal to any I have met in my life. He's awed by the talent pool at first. But he soon finds out that because these luminaries have come from all over, they all have to prove that they are luminaries. And so if someone sets forth a resolution that 2 + 2 shall equal 4, everyone has to stand and bloviate on it and expound upon it and wax eloquent about it, and then the motion gets passed unanimously, he says. There is so much wit, sense, learning, acuteness, subtlety, eloquence, etc. among 50 gentlemen, each of whom has been habituated to lead and guide in his own province, that an immensity of time is spent unnecessarily. He discovers that he's going to do okay, and these people are not all they're cracked up to be, in a bag of chips besides. One of the folks that makes an immediate impression on him is an attorney from Pennsylvania named John Dickinson. I don't do PowerPoints very often, so I got to remember. Ooh, John Dickinson. There we go. Okay, I got it. He is a shadow, tall but slender as a reed, pale as ashes. One would think at first sight that he could not live a month. But he has an excellent heart, and the cause of his country lies near it. Dickinson is there representing Pennsylvania. He lives just outside of Dover, Delaware, and Delaware at that point is still part of Pennsylvania. He has moved into Philadelphia, married into a prominent family. His wealth expands exponentially as a result. He does great brisk business, and that's how he kind of gets into the politics. And he makes himself famous not just in Pennsylvania, but across all the colonies by publishing a pamphlet in 1767 called Notes from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And Dickinson adopts this sort of persona of this homespun little farmer going, oh, golly gee whiz, these taxes are really hurting me and my farm, you know? And it resonates strongly across the colonies because he speaks in a pretty common language about issues that are hitting people in their pocketbooks. And it makes Dickinson literally one of the most famous men in the entire colonies. And Adams finds that he is, very much in sympathy with Dickinson's thoughts. But when they come together for the Second Continental Congress, the end of April, they actually convene at the beginning of May, but they start getting together in April of 1775. Adams finds that Dickinson is much more conservative than he first came across as. And this bothers Adams because he thought that they were in simpatico, but Dickinson will really serve as the lead advocate for the reconciliation movement. Let's patch things up with the king. Let's just kiss and make up and pretend all this tension doesn't exist, right? And in fact, Dickinson even says to Adams, you New Englanders keep up with your ways. There's going to be blood on your heads. But there's already blood. By this point, blood has been shed on Lexington Green and at the North Bridge in Concord, and along what today we call the Battle Road. For Adams, this is not theoretical. There has already been blood. And here he says that Massachusetts has now passed the Rubicon. And so there'll be great tension as the New Englanders in particular really kind of push for some sort of split from Great Britain, even as Dickinson and the middle colonies really push for reconciliation. And in the meantime, like, there's a siege of Boston going on. The Battle of Bunker Hill happens in June. The army around Boston sends word to the Congress, please help. And Congress decides to adopt the army, transforming it from a group of New England militia into a truly continental army. And Adams will nominate to head the army a tall Virginian by the name of George Washington. It's important to look as though a Virginian is at the head of this business, he thinks, right? And Washington and Virginia militia will start moving up, and that will put other colonies at stake in this, what has been a regional conflict. And because the Congress is willing to adopt the army and are willing to send George Washington away, the New Englanders are willing to kind of back off a little bit and support these treaties of peace and pacification. And Dickinson will actually send off what is known as the Olive Branch Petition on July 5th, 1775, which the king doesn't even read. In fact, the king doesn't even accept it. In fact, the king says that the colonies are in open rebellion and orders blockades of ports. He'll burn Falmouth. Down in Virginia, things get really riled up. John Adams really wants to say, I told you so, but he doesn't. Okay? But in the midst of all this tension, of course, John's venting through his pen, and he tells one of his friends, he refers to Dickinson in a letter as a piddling genius whose fame has been trumpeted so loudly, was given a silly cast to our whole doings. And that letter gets intercepted and printed in a pro-loyalist newspaper in Boston. And word reaches Philadelphia. And so one day, Adams is walking down the street, Dickinson coming the other way. Adams bows and doffs his cap, and Dickinson walks by in the most haughty manner, doesn't bow, doesn't doff his hat. And Adams says, I was determined to make my bow to see what his temper was, and it seems as though we will not be on bowing or speaking terms for the present. They do keep things cordial and professional on the floor of Congress because they continue to spar and debate, but the friendship that had once been is over. So as Adams is in Philadelphia in 74 and 75, he's writing back and forth to Abigail. I'm one of those people that thinks you can't say enough positive things about Abigail Adams. Like George Washington is one of those people, like you can't say enough positive things about Washington. We wouldn't have a country without him for all sorts of reasons. We can't say enough positive things about Abigail. She is just an extraordinary person in extraordinary circumstances. Maybe I have a little crush on her, I don't know. Okay? Now, they first met in 1759 when John was courting Hannah Quincy, so he doesn't have a very good impression of her. He says that she is not fond, not frank, not candid. Well, his eyes are full of the Hannah Quincy stars, so he can't see things very clearly. But 2 years later, they get reacquainted, and his perception is entirely different. He refers to her company as a constant feast, tender, feeling, sensible, friendly, a friend, not an imprudent, not an indelicate, not a disagreeable word or action, prudent, modest, delicate, soft, sensible, obliging, active. He is smitten with her, not only because she's pretty, but because she has such an incredible intellect. She didn't get a whole lot of formal schooling, but her father was a preacher, had a large library, encouraged her to read. She was fluent in French. She's just well-read. She's got a very active mind. She's very clever, very witty. And John just loves this. He is enlivened by her company. And she falls for him because he values that at a time when men typically did not value those sorts of things in women. And that becomes the whole basis of their relationship. They see each other as equal partners. through the whole course of their marriage. And there are many things John thinks, like, she's a lot better at. When he's away, he thinks the farm runs better. He says, I'm a little embarrassed to come back to town. The neighbors think that the farm runs better when I'm not there than when I am. You know? But it's because of that separation that we know so much about their relationship. Joseph Ellis talks about it as the paradox of proximity. When they're together, they're not writing letters. When they're apart, they are. And they've left more than 1,100 letters for us to read. That's one of the cool things about being a historian. We get to read other people's mail. It's awesome, right? But you can too. And you'll find them to be wonderful company. Now, she's supportive of him going off to Philadelphia in the first place. She says, I long for you to take your place on the stage of action. You know, and she's used to him being away. He rides the circuit all the time. So if he's gone to Philadelphia a couple weeks, a couple months, all right, you know, no big deal. Not realizing that they're going to spend more than a quarter of their relationship separated. And it is taxing on both of them. And if you read their letters, you can hear them going back and forth. And John is in angst about it. And he knows his kids are growing up without him at a time when kids need their father around. And he suffers health problems from it, his eyesight and migraines. And, you know, she's stuck up here around Boston with armies around and soldiers and smallpox. And she's got a nasty squatter she has to deal with. And all of these tensions. And yet she lets him stay away. She lets him stay away. And I'm convinced that at any point, Abigail could have said, enough, John. Come home. This is nonsense. And he would have. And he'd have been miserable. But he'd have done it. And she lets him stay. And for that reason, she characterizes their separation as her form of national service. She is sacrificing for the country so that her husband can go be John Adams. And we are fortunate that she is patient enough to do that, because it is a hard separation. I want to just focus on one component of their correspondence, their most famous one, because I think it illustrates a lot of cool things about their relationship. This comes from a letter that was published on March 31st, 1776. Once I get started here, you'll recognize it. In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, she told him, and urged him instead to willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. So John reads this, and he detects in her tone a note of playfulness. Historians criticize his response for being perhaps a bit patriarchal or a bit condescending, but I think that misses the point of their fuller relationship and their fuller correspondence, where they often teased and poked, and they were sort of kidding on the square. Whenever I use that expression at home, my wife's like, "You're using an old man expression now," and I'm sorry. And so he responds in kind. He says, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We've been told that our strugglers loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. Now, this is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out. And I love his use of the word saucy there. If you read their correspondence, they are saucy indeed, all sorts of different ways. One of my favorite instances is when he's in Washington as president, and she's teasing him about being a 60-year-old man, and he's like, oh, well, if I was home, I'd show you I wasn't a man more than 40. It's just like they've got this incredible energy between the two of them. So he continues, depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly in practice, because you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give this up, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. Okay? And maybe he is able to be playful because of the sort of relationship that they have, and maybe he's a little naive about the fact that some women do have difficult marriages where they are abused or taken advantage of by their husbands, but that's not the kind of relationship he and Abigail have, and I think that's the place he's coming from as he responds. Well, Abigail, she's not going to let him have the last word. I cannot say that I think you very generous to the ladies. For whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember, arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. So she responds saying, she's still laughing, but like, I'm serious here too. And John gets it. And he lets her have the last word. He knows that she has bested him in this conversation. And he says, among all the disappointments and perplexities which have fallen to my share in life, nothing has contributed so much to support my mind as the choice blessings of a wife, whose capacity enabled her to comprehend and whose pure virtue obliged her to approve the views of a husband. This has been the cheering consolation of my heart in my most solitary, gloomy, and disconsolate hours. In this remote situation, I'm deprived in a great measure of this comfort, yet I read and read again your charming letters, and they serve me in some faint degree as a substitute for the company and conversation of the writer. He misses her, and there's so much going on in Philadelphia at this time. And he sends her letters asking for advice, and he says, you love a political bone, chew on this one. And he asks her, what should we do about this? What should we do about the western boundaries? What should we do about representation and houses? And she will answer. And he loves that he's got someone that he can use as a sounding board. When he's vice president, he writes to her and he says, I can do nothing without you. And he means it. And it is remarkable for us that she has the intelligence and patience to put up with it. So he goes home for Christmas in 1775, and on his way back, he stops at a bookstore in New York, and he picks up this sensational new pamphlet called Common Sense, written by a 36-year-old Scotch immigrant named Thomas Paine. It's anonymously published, but Paine's identity comes out pretty quickly. And what Paine does in Common Sense is he argues for independence in a clear, forceful way that everybody can understand. Up to now, it's been the politicians and the folks in all the state capitals having all these discussions, but Paine puts the argument in the language of the public house rather than the courthouse, says one historian. And it says things like, it makes no sense that a continent could be ruled by an island. And people are like, duh, of course not, right? It's like that sort of thing. And so it's brilliant, and it has a huge seismic shift on public opinion, getting folks to start talking openly, publicly, forcefully in favor of independence. Congressional attitudes will be a little slower to shift, but this wave of public opinion will start to move the delegates in Congress. Adams is really impressed by this. He buys a copy, sends it to Abigail, buys copies, sends to some of his friends, and he says, the parts about independence I liked very much. But we forget today a huge part of common sense isn't just this argument in favor of independence. There's a whole part of the thing that talks about, like, once we declare independence, here's what our new governments should look like. And it's sort of like the armchair quarterback telling the Hall of Famer, here's what you should do, right? Anybody in here want to just go give Tom Brady lessons on how to play football? Okay, I don't, but that was sort of like Thomas Paine's Common Sense was doing the same sort of thing. And so Adams gets really bothered by this, and the more he sits with common sense, the more annoyed he gets. And so he decides that he's going to do everything he can to speak out against these ideas of Paine's. And as it happens, a lot of the delegates in Congress are asking for his advice. Well, what should these new governments look like if we declare independence? And 2 delegates from North Carolina have been summoned back to take part in a new constitutional convention for the colony. And they both independently come to Adams and say, what should our new government look like if we declare independence? So he writes out a letter and gives it to one of them. He writes out a letter and gives it to another one. Well, then a guy from New Jersey, like, oh, yeah, can I have one of those? So Adams writes out a copy to him. And then Reverend Wyeth from Virginia is like, hey, are you giving out copies? Can I take a look at your thoughts too? So Adams writes out a big long copy for him. And then Richard Henry Lee from Virginia is like, I'd love to have a copy of that. And he publishes it in the paper. And it becomes known as Thoughts on Government. The anniversary of which it was published on April 22nd, so just a week and a day ago, 250 years past. Has anybody here read Thoughts on Government? Okay. Oh, okay. A couple people actually, yeah, which is more than most crowds I talk to, okay? Most of us don't and have much familiarity with this pamphlet, but I'm sure you know what it says. For instance, 3 equal branches of a government, including an independent judiciary, a bicameral legislature responsible for making laws that will serve as checks and balances on each other. One of those would be a big body of representatives, and one would be a smaller, more elite house. A chief executive who's responsible for carrying out those laws with departments, cabinet positions. Does this sound familiar? Military control by civilians. Yeah. We think about the summer of 1787, and we think about James Madison as the father of the Constitution. That all comes from Adams's Thoughts on Government. 9 of the colonial legislatures pass new governments that resemble the structure he sets up. So it's highly influential. Among those places that adopt it, including Virginia, where James Mason is responsible for passing their constitution. He's going to have a huge role in what happens in 1787. And so even though we don't associate Adams with the Constitution necessarily, it's all his, baby. It's all his, okay? And when Thoughts on Government comes out, Paine finds out who wrote it, and he comes to him and he says, your pamphlet is going to kneecap mine. And Adams is like, yes, that's the point. And they have this great little exchange, a pleasant conversation. They don't come to any sort of resolution about it. And then off Paine goes. And here, Paine's still a good guy at this point, and he'll write The American Crisis, These Are the Times that Try Men's Souls, but he gets mouthier and mouthier and mouthier. Adams gets him a job with the government, and he has to leave his position for mishandling state secrets. He gets really involved with the French Revolution. He writes pamphlets in support of that. He writes pamphlets against religion. He starts criticizing George Washington late in his career. You can't poke George Washington. And so Paine falls from grace, and Adams's opinion of him plummets. And his final assessment of common sense, I got to read this because it's great. A poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass. Crapulous mass. How do you really think, John? You all right? Okay. But he admits late in life, I know not whether any man in the world has had more influence on its inhabitants or affairs for the last 30 years than Thomas Paine. There can be no severer satyr on the age, for such a mongrel between pig and puppy, begotten by a wild boar on a bitch wolf, never before in any age of the world was suffered the poltroonery of mankind to run through the career of such mischief. Call it then the age of pain. Oh, how do you really feel, John? You know, So common sense does trigger events to move at a super rapid pace, which brings us now to June 1776, and Adams's relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was elected to the Second Continental Congress. He shows up, doesn't say much at all. Adams actually says, I don't think I ever heard him say more than 3 sentences in a single conversation. But in committee work, his ideas come out. In conversation, his ideas come out. In writing, his ideas come out. Jefferson is a radical in favor of independence. He gets his position because he had written a summary view of the rights of British America, which really talks about how the crown is abusing its people. And so they send him to Philadelphia. He doesn't want to be there. And by August, he goes home because he misses his wife, who's in spotty health. And he stays away for the rest of 1775 and comes back in May of 1776, just in time to become immortal. What timing, right? He shows up and things are coming to a head with this independence stuff. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia puts forward a resolution for independence. Adams seconds it. He allows Lee to put forward the motion because it should be as though a Virginian is at the head of this business as the most influential, biggest, and richest colony. But Adams has been the driving force behind this. And so as they start to debate this, the conservatives under Dickinson make a motion to table it, and it gets tabled, and Dickinson's like, whew, and he thinks it's a victory. But Congress is like, well, we shouldn't just sit around. Let's write something up. So if we do decide to say yes to this idea, we've got something we can debate. And so Dickinson's like, oh, darn, you know. Delegations go back to get instructions from their state capitals, and Jefferson, Adams, Ben Franklin will sit down with Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert Livingston of New York, and they'll begin to draft a document that has become immortal that none of them really thought was that big of a deal at the time. In fact, there's some debate over who writes the thing. Adams and Jefferson both tell slightly different stories, but to hear Adams tell it, he is the one who, well, they first asked Franklin, because Franklin's the most famous writer in America, and as the musical 1776 says, that he refuses to use a pen in Pennsylvania because he will not write anything that will be edited by a committee. And if anybody here has ever written anything edited by a committee, you can completely empathize, okay? So Franklin's used to writing little pithy statements in his Poor Richard's Almanac. He's not doing this. So then Adams and Jefferson have to go back and forth. And so Adams really cajoles Jefferson into do it. And he says, number one, you're a Virginian, and it should appear as though Virginians at the head of this business. Number two, I'm obnoxious and disliked. And this is Adams writing this account later in life. And as David McCullough has thoroughly researched, no one in 1776 calls Adams obnoxious or disliked. He says it of himself in his grand old man years at Peacefield. But it makes its way into 1776. It's a great show-stopping number, and it's a joke that runs through the whole thing, and it has become part of the Adams legacy, unfortunately. At this point in his career, he's actually on 24 different committees, chairing more than a dozen of them himself. You don't get that sort of responsibility if nobody likes you, right? But he is worried that the conservatives under Dickinson might just, as a knee-jerk reaction, vote against the Declaration. And I think that's a reasonable fear on his part. And then he also says that Jefferson's 10 times the writer he is. And that's probably true as well, although Adams certainly had great chops as a writer. He's selling himself a little bit short. So on the 11th of June, the committee gets together. Jefferson's going to sequester himself away in his little apartment on Market Street, spend 3 weeks writing, and he'll come back with a draft on the 28th of June. Congress will accept it, hold on to it while they take care of some other business, and it's on the agenda for July 1st, 1776. Adams writes to a friend in Georgia that today the great question of independence shall be decided. And he's expecting a pretty quick vote. They've been talking about this for months and months and months. Who has anything new to say? We're going to go in there. We're going to do this. Storm clouds are gathering over Philadelphia, but Adams has seen clear skies. He gets to Independence Hall. Congress gavels itself into session. They take care of a few bits of administrative business, and then they organize themselves into a committee of the whole to discuss the resolution on independence. And immediately, John Dickinson rises to his feet. And he says, "My conduct this day, I suspect, will give the finishing blow to my once great and now too diminished popularity." But he firmly believes in this idea of reconciliation, and he cannot let his principles go to the side. And so he feels compelled to stand up and argue one last time against independence and in favor of reconciliation. And his speech lasts almost 2 hours, and it is so brilliant that even Adams is impressed. Dickinson is exhausted by the end of it. He slumps back into his chair, even as rain begins to patter on the tall windows of the room. It sounds like a fiction writer made that up, but it's true. Thunder begins to rumble outside. The whole room holds its breath. And Adams says that everyone waited to see who would stand to answer Dickinson. No one does. And Adams says that he's hoping that someone less obnoxious than he would answer the call. But I think he's kidding himself and he's kidding us when he writes that. Who else is going to stand up in this moment? Who else has been the leading voice for independence all these months? Of course, they're all waiting for John. And he finally, and in his words, reluctantly stands up and addresses the question. For 4 hours, he speaks extemporaneously, speaking with such force of passion that Jefferson says he moved us from our seats. His contemporaries write about his eloquence beyond eloquence. Partway through the speech, the delegation from New Jersey comes in, and they're like, what did we miss? What did we miss? Could you repeat that? And he does. And then he finally sits down. We don't know what he said. It was extemporaneous. But we know that it must have changed some minds. But not enough minds. Because when they do a straw vote at the end of that day, 4 colonies hold out. Pennsylvania, no surprise. John Dickinson's from Pennsylvania. Delaware. It's a 3-man delegation, 1 man for every county. Although when I was down there a few months ago, they told me that Delaware only has 2 counties at high tide. It's so small, right? They have 2 of their guys there. The third, Caesar Rodney's back home, sick with facial cancer. And he's the tie-breaking vote. So Delaware's not going to vote. New York has not received its instructions from its state capital. They're not going to vote yes. And South Carolina says, well, we are thinking that we're going to vote no as well, although in the interest of unanimity, if some other states choose to switch their votes, we shall switch our vote as well. So that night, there's a tremendous amount of horse trading, discussion, debate, cajoling, trying to find those extra votes. Someone rides to Dover, Delaware, and rouses Caesar Rodney from his sickbed. He rides 70 miles through a thunderstorm in the pouring rain overnight to show up at the doors of Independence Hall, even as they're gaveling into session for the morning. He shows up. He's a yes. Delaware is a yes. New York has not received its instructions yet, but they have decided rather than voting against independence, they will abstain. So they can't be a yes, but they won't be a no. South Carolina, seeing the change of temperature in the room, changes its vote from a no to a yes. But most importantly, Pennsylvania moves to the yes column. John Dickinson cannot bring himself to change his vote. Neither can his friend Robert Morris. But understanding the momentum, understanding the need for unanimity, they both intentionally absent themselves from the morning's proceedings. They call in sick and stay home. James Wilson changes his vote to yes, breaking the tie, and Pennsylvania is a yes. And on July 2nd, 1776, Congress votes in favor of independence. The next day, it's time to bring up the draft. Poor Jefferson sits in the back of the room as they go through his whole thing. They chop out a quarter of it. It's agony. Oh my gosh. He doesn't argue against any of it, but he sits and he squirms. Franklin's sitting next to him, kind of nudging him. Isn't this terrible? Isn't this awful? You'll be fine, son. You'll be fine. Okay, but Adams stands up and he argues for every word, every phrase, every sentence, every paragraph. He is the chief proponent of this document on the floor of the Congress, which finally adopts it on the 3rd, sends it off to a printer, and then it comes back and is publicly read on the 4th of July. Independence has been declared. Richard Stockton of New Jersey said, "He it was who sustained the debate, and by the force of his reasoning demonstrated not only the justice but the expediency of the measure. The man to whom the country is most indebted for the great measure of independence is John Adams. I call him the Atlas of Independence." Adams is beside himself with joy at this achievement. He understands what a monumental thing this is. Literally, in the history of the world, what a monumental thing this is. And so he writes to Abigail, "I'm apt to believe that Independence Day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." He wrote that to Abigail on July 3rd, referring to July 2nd, not July 4th, right? Because the independence was declared on the 2nd, right? But this is why Jefferson wins history, because it's the document, that tangible thing. We don't know what John said on the floor of the Congress. We don't know how he argued for the Declaration, but we have the document. We've got something tangible, and it's written in really pretty words that speak to the better angels of our nature, if I can borrow a Lincoln phrase. And this is why, this is Jefferson holding the pose. All men are created equal. And Adams is like, no, they're not. They're just created, let me explain this, right? Adams can't hold the pose, but Jefferson can. That's why Jefferson wins. That's why 4th of July instead of 2nd of July is Independence Day. And so this is where we all sort of independence, we're done, right? Except that even as this is happening, the British are landing troops on Staten Island. I promise we're in the home stretch, though. Okay, the Declaration means nothing unless this dude can do something about it to back it up. And Adams will serve as the head of a new board of war, essentially being the new Secretary of War, the first that we ever have, and he's going to be in charge of all the logistics to support Washington's army. And Adams will have a great relationship with Washington for all of his life. He really respects him. He's the guy who nominated him, remember? In private, he'll sometimes criticize some of Washington's actions. Like after the army gets beaten at the Battle of Long Island, he says, in general, generals got out-generaled, okay? But in public, he is nothing but full-throated support for Washington, which ultimately gets him in trouble when Washington becomes president. Adams is vice president, and he's arguing like the president should have a great exalted title. It should be like His Highness, great awesome master dude, protector of our rights and liberties. And the Senate's like, that's nonsense. But Adams had just come from the courts of Europe where everybody has a fancy title. And so he wanted Washington to be in the same league as these monarchs. Not because he believed in monarchy, but because he believed Washington had that same sort of cachet. And the Senate's like, we're just going to call him Mr. President. And they're going to call Adams his rotundity, okay? Making fun of his weight. Ironically, this will create a rift between Adams and Washington. Washington is a little embarrassed by the whole thing, and he thinks it's maybe Adams showing some poor judgment. And so Washington never brings Adams into the cabinet as a full advisor. Like, the last month of Washington's presidency, the two of them have dinner, and Adams leaves saying, I had no idea he and I think exactly the same on exactly everything. I mean, they're really in sync. He never had the chance to work closely enough to know it. Okay? But what does aggravate Washington what aggravates Adams is that he lives in Washington's shadow. And he doesn't even mind that so much. It's just that everyone's like, Washington is so awesome. And Adams is like, I did stuff too, you know? And so it's when he doesn't get the credit he feels he deserves, like when Mercy Otis Warren writes her History of the American Revolution, and, you know, Washington's awesome and John's kind of not in there. And it's like, you're one of my best friends and you left me out of your book. What's the deal? Like, Adams just gets beside himself because he's constantly competing with Washington's shadow. And it hits close to home. Like when Washington's president, he does a lot to cultivate John Quincy's career as a diplomat. So much so that when John Quincy and Catherine Louisa have their first child, they name him George Washington Adams, right? Ooh, that stings Abigail a little bit. She lets John Quincy know. We don't know that John actually says anything to John Quincy about it. We know that his feelings are a little hurt. Son number 2 becomes John Adams Jr., John Adams III, okay? So it's a really complicated relationship that Adams has with Washington. But he says, you know, when people write the history of the Revolution, it's going to be as though Dr. Franklin smote the ground with his electric rod, and out sprang General Washington, and the two of them together conducted all the military, political, and diplomatic affairs to win the revolution. And that's kind of what happens. And it brings us to our final person to talk about here tonight, Ben Franklin. The most famous man in America, comes to the independence movement a little late. Adams works with him in Congress. They get along well. Adams thinks that Franklin's a little bit eccentric, has this theory of colds, keep the window open, fresh air is good for you. When Franklin eventually dies of a cold, Adams has something to say about that. Okay. But everything goes fine until Franklin gets sent on a diplomatic mission to help bring France into the war. And by all accounts, he does a good job of it. But the delegation is dysfunctional. Silas Deane, one of the other commissioners, is accused of mismanagement and war profiteering, so he gets recalled and Adams gets sent to France to join the delegation. And what he finds is like Franklin is working the room, okay? And at first, he's like, oh, you know, this is kind of the Franklin I'm used to, sitting there in the corner, kind of nodding his head, looking wise and sagely and, you know, just offering witty things to say here and there. But because Adams lives with Franklin, he kind of gets to see behind the curtain. This is that moment from The Wizard of Oz where they say, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And Adams gets to see behind the curtain, and he's horrified because he discovers, like, Franklin is sitting in all of these meetings and in these parlors and looking all wise and sagely and nodding, and because he doesn't understand French. So he's just smile and nod, Just wearing his little coonskin hat, looking like he's the old rustic American. Not a person in France doesn't seem to know him, and they all think he's a great friend of all humanity. But that's because every single thing Franklin does is an attempt to curate his image. If you've ever read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, it is one of the greatest works of American fiction, right? Because he wants you to see a certain image of himself. And so Franklin is always cultivating that image. And when Adams gets to see behind the curtain, he's just, And they have different philosophies on diplomacy, too. Like Adams is like, we need money, we need troops, we need supplies, we need this. And Franklin's like, let's just see what the French give us. And Adams is like, no, we got to push for this. So they come to loggerheads, so much so that Franklin will actually then undermine Adams's presence and get him fired from his job. Adams will just go to the Netherlands. He'll negotiate some loans with the Dutch, which do a lot to help keep America solvent. And then he gets this urgent letter from John Jay, who gets sent to Paris. And he says, you got to get over here. The British are ready to sue for peace. You're part of the delegation. Come back here. Franklin's about to give away the store. So Adams rushes back to Paris. You can see them in that painting. We don't have any British representatives because they didn't want to be painted as surrendering. So we only get the American delegation. And it turns out Franklin's very much in league with Jay and Adams in their approach to how to surrender. They're not going to take the lead that the French offer. Instead, they're going to negotiate terms separately. And so that finally brings an end with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. You can tell I'm a Civil War guy. I never failed to not get into the 1860s. So the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And so it's super frustrating for Adams. And he writes, and Franklin writes a rather damning account of him that becomes part of the Adams baggage. He means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. And we kind of, and that harms Adams's reputation, and he's really upset about it because he's working hard, and here you got this charlatan, he calls him, this great conjurer, he calls him. His final assessment of Franklin, that he was a great genius, a great wit, a great humorist, and a great satirist, and a great politician is certain. That he was a great philosopher, a great moralist, and a great statesman is more questionable. But on the whole, he assessed Franklin as a man of very moderate abilities, but admitted he was one of the most curious characters in history. And so looking at their relationship together really kind of helps us understand Adams's successes and failings as a diplomat. To ramp up our story, he becomes minister to the court of St. James, where he meets another person he's had a lot of argument with, King George, who actually compliments him as an honest man. Adams considers that one of the greatest compliments he receives in his life. He'll serve as vice president to George Washington for 2 terms. He'll be elected president himself for 1 term, tries to keep the U.S. out of war with France successfully. But because of all of that pro and anti-French those sentiments, all the pro and anti-French sentiments. You've got Alexander Hamilton stabbing him in the back every chance he gets because he's jealous. So Adams loses the election of 1800. If you ever think politics today is divided, go read a newspaper from 1799 and you'll get a whole new appreciation for how divided politics can be. Okay? And then he retires back here to Quincy for what I like to call his grumpy old man years. And it just takes him a while to mellow out. And it's hard, and he's just thrashing against everything. He's thrashing against history. He's thrashing against Mercy Otis Warren and George Washington's legacy. Abigail helps him chill out, and he finally relaxes, and he can finally get to the point where he can enjoy life, and he does. And his later writings are just wonderful because he can laugh at himself finally, he can laugh at the world finally, he's got grandkids around, he just gets to be a happy old man for a while. And so, of course, that brings us to the very end of the story, because as part of those happy years, he strikes up a correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, with whom he has been estranged since that election of 1800. And it's important to note, when Adams was elected president, he and Jefferson had dinner with Washington, and as they left that dinner, Adams said, I want you to be part of the cabinet. I didn't get to do that with Washington. I want you to be a full and equal partner in this administration. And Jefferson thinks about it, but Madison talks him out of it. He says, you can't be the leader of the opposition if you're in the room. And so Jefferson says no. Now imagine how history might have been different if Jefferson had said yes. It's a what if we don't have time to get into. But that starts this breach between the two of them that is really just turns into a rupture by the election of 1800. They start patching things up thanks to the mutual work of a friend, Benjamin Rush. And they start writing back, and they pretend like nothing ever happened. And it's like, Jefferson, I love him. I've never been mad at him. And Jefferson's like, Adams, I love him just like a brother. And they just have this great happy reunion, and they're going back and forth, and they're trying not to stir the pot, and they're just being very friendly and cordial and glad. And of course, Adams can't hold the pose. And so finally he says, we should not die until we have the chance to explain ourselves to each other. And then that opens up the correspondence, because they stop writing to each other, although they're still doing it, but they're writing to us, right? As they write to each other. History is reading these words. And the two great statesmen who had very different ideas about what the revolution meant begin to explain themselves to each other. And we can read their mail, remember? And I urge you to go back and see what these two men had to say to each other, because they're arguing over the same things we're arguing over today. It is the exact same arguments. And that's the brilliance of it, is that the argument is the point. Because somewhere between those two sides is a middle that we have to inhabit. And what does that middle mean? And what are those answers? And how do we live with them? The argument is the point. And when we stop arguing, we end up with the Civil War, right? Which to me is a very good reason to not give up on the argument, right? 740,000 lives, shattered families, wounded men, widows and orphans, millions of wrecked. That's a really good reason for us to not give up on the argument. And we can go back and see what they had to say to each other and learn from their example. Now, as you know, the two of them both die on the same day, within hours of each other, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, on July 4th, 1826. As Jefferson's lying in his deathbed, he actually has a bust of John Adams across the room, looking down on him as he's in his sickbed. And Jefferson, always posing for history, wakes up early in the morning and he says, "Is it the 4th yet?" Very conscious of the timing. And he'll eventually pass away. Adams here has a fairly quick end. And among his last words, he nods to his friend. He says, "Jefferson survives." Even though Jefferson had predeceased him by a few hours. But Adams knew, in a way that is very Adamsian, that Jefferson would out-survive him. Jefferson wins history because he could hold the pose. He could stand there and look handsome in his buckled shoes. John had something he had to tell you. And as I worked on this book and got to read his letters and spend time with him and with Jefferson and with Abigail and with John Quincy and so many more, John has something to tell us today. If you read those letters for yourself, you will find, as I did, that they are wonderful company. Thank you for the privilege to be with you today. Do we have time for questions? Okay. The boss says yes, we have time for questions. Anybody have any questions? Everyone say, can we go home now? That's a question, right? My butt is sore in these seats. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, how influential were Jefferson and Adams in their old age?
How influential were Adams and Jefferson in their old age? Certainly as grand old men of the Republic, they are really important symbols and figureheads. They often get trotted out for public ceremonies. When the Marquis de Lafayette makes his big continental tour, he's got to go see them both, that kind of thing. So they have huge symbolic importance. They are somewhat of dinosaurs, philosophically or politically, so they don't necessarily have a whole lot of impact on that. But of course, Adams's impact lasts well beyond his own time in office, because he names John Marshall to the Supreme Court. That has 30 years of impact. So even though Adams isn't directly impacting things, that decision is a huge one. And then John Quincy comes along and becomes president of the United States. Doesn't necessarily have a successful presidency, but his post-presidential career is hugely influential. And I would trace that back to his parents as well. Jefferson kind of sits on his mountaintop, and he's happy to be in retirement. And as people write to him and ask him for advice all the time, he's got a huge active correspondence, but he basically abdicates responsibility for a lot of things, like slavery. It's too thorny, that's for the next generation. He realizes his time has passed. So, kind of a long answer, but...
You said that we should read those letters, and what people argued about at that time are similar to what we're arguing about now. Can you give me an example?
So an example of the sorts of things that they were arguing about then versus now. What's the balance between federal and state power? Okay, for instance, who are the people? Okay, and how does the people as an entity hold and exercise its power? And that was a brilliant kind of cheat. The people are the sovereigns, but how do you exercise that sovereignty? Is it through elections and your elected representatives that then hold your power, or do you get to revoke that? Right? Okay. What's the role of party? So those are some examples of the sorts of things they're going back and forth about. So, other questions? Other questions? Well, thank you all very much for your time tonight. Please support the Historical Society. There are copies of the book in the back, and I want to thank the bookstore for setting up shop out there. I'd be happy to sign anything if folks are interested in that. But please make sure that the Quincy Historical Society is part of your monthly lives. Come down here, take advantage of their programs, take advantage of the great work that they're doing down here. This history belongs to you, so make sure that you get to enjoy it. Thank you very much.